Oh, I'm Thea Wieseltier, the Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. It is also my great honor to welcome my dear friends and colleagues, Letty Cottin Pogrebin and Deborah Kolben. Letty Cottin Pogrebin is founding editor and writer for Ms. Magazine. She's the author of 12 books, including her most recent, Shanda, a memoir of shame and secrecy. Besides her nearly 20-year affiliation with Ms. Magazine, Letty has published articles and op-eds in dozens of national periodicals. She has been a regular columnist for Moment magazine since 1991, and for 10 years wrote The Working Woman column in the Ladies' Home Journal. Letty will be in conversation with 70 Faces Media Chief Content Officer and founding editor of Kveller, Deborah Kolben. On behalf of our team at Kveller and its parent company, 70 Faces Media, we thank you for joining us for this program. Please check us out at kveller.com. And now I turn it over to Debbie.
Thanks, Thea. Welcome, Letty. We're so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Like many Jewish women, I feel like I've followed your career and your work, and it feels like a real honor and a privilege to be able to sit here and ask you questions.
Ask away. Thank you.
I have many things that I would love to ask you, but I would love to start with your book, which everyone should have a copy of. Shonda, a memoir of shame and secrecy. I love people who talk about the things that we're not supposed to talk about, especially women who talk about those things. Those are my favorite kind of women. So I would love to have you start out by telling us a little bit about Shonda, about why you wrote this book, and just sort of what the story is behind it.
Yes, thank you again for having me, Debbie, Thea. I'm really quite thrilled and a little intimidated by what I've heard this group is constituted with, a lot of hip young Jewish women. Thank you for tuning in. As I think probably everyone knows, Shonda is shame or disgrace or scandal in Yiddish. And I grew up hearing the line, "It's a Shanda, it's a Shanda," throughout my childhood. And I think it imprinted me. I mean, it told me what was acceptable and what was to be hidden. Hiddenness is a theme throughout Judaism, and certainly was throughout the history of our people. If we didn't hide, we wouldn't be here. We know how to hide, whether we're forced to hide or whether we choose to reinvent ourselves. So in my case, my family reinvented themselves in order to avoid being found out as imperfect. They were an immigrant family. They came over here. They had to, the women had to learn to cook chocolate pudding and cottage cheese with fruit and Jello and stuff that was completely alien to them. And the men had to notice that their shoes were wrong. I mean, there was so much to adjust to and so much to be ashamed of. And so it started with my grandparents. I talk about this because for me, they are the original sinners of secrecy in our family. My grandmother, it turns out, was a runaway bride. She was forced to marry a man. If you think about Fiddler on the Roof, you can see the scene. She was betrothed to a man much older than herself. And she was, think about, that's Laser Wolf the butcher. And think about Muddle, Count Pemzoil, the tailor. And that was who my grandmother loved. So after the wedding to the Laser Wolf guy, my grandmother in the bridal chamber tied together all the bed sheets and jumped out the window and ran away to my grandfather and never told anybody this story except my mother, who was the eldest of 7, and the next in line, my Aunt Tilly. Well, just to set a theme right here that others might relate to, I think if we, the women of the family, had known that we had a transgressive, rebellious grandmother instead of somebody who was welded to her apron and making, knishes and being silent because she was afraid to reveal how little English she knew. And so she was speaking Yiddish, and we kids weren't allowed to learn Yiddish. If we had known we had that Wonder Woman under that, sort of schleppy shawl, we would have been freed to be transgressive ourselves. We could have been feminist inspired by our grandmother. Instead, she hid it till the day she died. I only found out from my aunt when I was in my 30s. So that was a Shanda. That's an example of a kind of original Shanda in my family. Probably everyone listening has one somewhere where you found out and you were just totally shocked and you had to recalibrate how you saw the person.
Letty, you said that you, had you known, you could have been transgressive and you could have been a feminist, yet you are both those things, right? So.
Yeah, but it took a lifetime. I mean, I also tell the story about my abortions, and I was so ashamed. I was deathly ashamed that I, in my senior year at Brandeis, got pregnant a second time within 6 months. And I was, as you know from reading the book, I was ready to jump off either of two bridges that connected, the other boroughs with the Queens. And eventually, after I tell the whole story in the book, but afterwards, years later, my sister and I are talking, and I suddenly blurt out this story because I had never asked for help because I thought all my relatives were pristine, perfect Jewish women and mothers,
Right.
Then my sister tells me, I can't believe you didn't share this with me. I know what that's like. I had an abortion. I said, you had an abortion? How could this be? My perfect suburban, sister, mother of four. And then my sister admitted that my mother had an abortion. My grandmother had an abortion. Now, again, if I knew that, I wouldn't have gone through it alone. I wouldn't have been on point of suicide.
Right. Well, you skipped ahead to my section on abortion, so I'm going to come back to that because I found that part really powerful, and I have some questions for you. I was going to ease into that, but you just jumped right in, Letty.
I might as well get it out there.
I appreciate that. I'm curious why you decided to write this book now. Like, why did you decide to put this out into the world now?
Because it was going to be my 12th book. I was starting with a very traditional chronological memoir. I wanted to make sense of my life. I'm 83 now. I started this book when I was 78, looking at 80, which was terrifying and completely out of body. It was surreal to say, I'm going to be 80. I have to have some structure of what I've lived through, what it all stands for, what informed me. I've just kind of been barreling ahead. And when I started to write it, it just all came clear that it was all about shame. It was all about the Shanda. It was all about secrecy. It was all about hiding who you really were. And that, I think, is what made me a feminist, an activist. It made me someone who hates secrecy and has seen the erosions that the secrets cause.
Is there a difference between secret and Shonda?
Well, the Shonda is the shame part, and shame-based secrecy are the bad secrets because they corrode your sense of self. If you're keeping a secret that a friend of yours is cheating on her husband, that's her business. If you're keeping a secret that you've been cheating on your husband and you don't want anyone to know that you were miserable in your marriage, that's corrosive.
Right.
That's not a productive thing. That's not it's not a secret that leads to any kind of growth or self-actualization.
I was curious when reading this book and thinking about all the different kinds of secrets that are in here, right? Like you've already said, there's secret illness, there's secret abortion, there's secret sexual assault. I'm wondering for you, which secret or Shonda or however you would think about it felt the most difficult to reveal or share?
That's an easy one for me because I've written about this scene in everything I've ever written. It's somewhere in there. It's in a novel of mine. It's in my book, Deborah, Gold and Me, in some form or other. And that is the secrets my parents revealed to me when I was 12 years old about their lies, that they lied about their lives. And it happened. I was at a bar mitzvah of a cousin of mine in Winthrop, Massachusetts, and I was playing gin rummy with a cousin of mine. I'm one of 25 cousins, and my parents were each one of 7. So we have a humongous family on both sides. And I was playing cards with this cousin of mine who was 10 years older and was a very feisty woman. And I caught her with, I don't know, 32 or 33 points, which is a lot. And she got furious and started shouting at me that I thought I was such a big shot. I was 12. I didn't think I was a big shot. I just thought it was lucky that I could beat a 22-year-old at gin rummy. And then she threw the cards at me. And meanwhile, she's telling me that I think that's such a big deal. And my father wasn't even, didn't even have my mother as his wife. And my mother wasn't in this family. And she used to be the eldest. And now my sister Betty got lugged into the family, and now you think you're so great. And I just fainted dead away. Who could absorb all that? I was 12. I thought I had a perfect family. I thought everything was, I thought I had these long married parents who gave birth to my sister, who's 14 years older than I, and then they couldn't conceive. That was the story. They tried but couldn't. And then finally I was born. And here they were admitting to me that they each were married before. They each had a child, one of whom is a sister I thought was my whole sister, was my half sister, and that my father had a child too from a prior marriage. So somewhere in the world, I had a secret sister. I mean, I blacked out because it was just too much to absorb. And when I woke up, they walked with me on the beach and in Winthrop, Massachusetts, on a very, very cold day. Probably it was March or early April. And they told me the truth. And I have never been the same. I lost trust, the ability to trust for a really long time. And I think in a way, I became a writer. So you could always ask questions and peel the onion. If you're a writer, you can do that. Journalists can do that. And I never trusted surfaces again.
Right. And just so everyone understands who hasn't yet read the book, right, it was that your mother had a child before with
another man, and my father had a daughter with another woman. They had been divorced when it was a super Shanda to be divorced, 1927. And they didn't marry each other till 1937, but they lied and said they got married in 1923 to cover for my sister who was born in 1925. Then my father pretended to be, her biological father. I mean, it was a complete house of cards that was constructed in order to present this perfect surface, this facade of Jewish American. We made it. We are a long married, happy couple, and we have a house. And my father was a big shot in the shul, and my mother was a big shot in Hadassah and NCJW. I mean, the whole thing was built on sand, on lies.
There was for some reason it stayed with me, but in that scene when you're describing on the beach and you talk about your mother and she's in these stockings and in these shoes that are they're her nice shoes and they're very uncomfortable, but they look pretty and they have her bunions inside, and it just felt like a poignant detail. It reminded me of my grandmother too, somehow always like wearing these beautiful but uncomfortable shoes. And anyway,
I don't know how many of the people on this call were ever raised with the ethos that you have to suffer for being beautiful. You have to try everything. If it means, having your hair put up in curlers in those hot permanent machines that, they look like space cadet machines. Or if it's wearing shoes that pinch your toes and leave blisters on your heels. That was my mother's ethos, was beauty hurts. You had to do this for a man. It was kind of, so sad because these women lived such derivative lives, and their attempts to please their men or to become marriageable are kind of pathetic when we look at them now.
I'm wondering what it was like for your family to have you write a book like this, right? I think that like it's hard to write about the people you love. It's hard to write about family. And I feel like you can alienate people or inadvertently make them upset with the things that you share. I was just remembering the first piece that I ever published in my whole life. I was so excited. I published a piece in a publication called Bitch Magazine. And it was an interview with a Jewish Playboy playmate. And I think she was calling herself like the first openly Jewish Playboy playmate or something. And I was making an argument that she was like a feminist hero. Anyway, but I'm not sure I would still argue that.
Very third wave of you, Debbie.
It was you exactly. And I had like a throwaway line in the piece. And I said I was trying to say like that I knew all these different Jewish American princess jokes. And I said that my brother kept a copy of Truly Tasteless Jokes in the bathroom or something. It was like a throwaway line. And he was so mad at me and he was offended by it. And I don't even know it. And that was like that was a nothing, right? So what is it like for you to write so openly? Was it okay because many of the people that you write about maybe aren't alive anymore? How did your children experience this?
A couple of things come to mind. One is none of my mother's and father's generation was left. So I have all these cousins, not all of whom are left. I'm one of the younger cousins, so you can imagine how old some of them are. So I checked with my cousins. In fact, I interviewed my cousins because I'm a fact checker, even for Memoir. You know, I remember saying, was your father a stationery salesman or what did he do? And then trying to make sure everything was as correct as I could make it. But I also think it's important for those of you who are writers that you have to make a decision about whether your writing is more important than people's feelings. And for me, it didn't hack it. I wasn't going to hurt somebody. I have a friend who does that all the time, who, distinguishes herself by writing these shocking things about her family. And, she's kind of cutting edge and she shames them, I think, but she thinks she's being honest and she's ripping off the disguise, the masks. So I have always had my children read my stuff, even when I wrote a book called Growing Up Free, which was published in 1980 about non-sexist child rearing. When I talked about my children as a kind of illustration of some thesis I had or philosophy or principle or practice, I said, how do you feel about this being in a book? Someday you're going to be grown up. Is this okay? And I remember that my daughter, Robin, who is now and has been a reporter for the New York Times for 25 years, the one thing she objected to in a book I wrote called Family Politics was when I said that it was Getting Over Getting Older, was when I wrote that the shock of my life was when I found a gray pubic hair. She said, Mom, please don't do that. Don't go there. And I had to talk her into it. I said, Robin, you're going to find one day and you're going to be as shocked as I. It was like a sign of my mortality that I had a gray pubic hair. Who had ever seen a thing like that,
See, Letty, thank you for saying all the things that no one says. That's why.
Well, I only say the things that no one says because I really want to normalize what we already know is happening to women.
Yeah.
But nobody talks about it. It's for some reason we keep the secrets that prevent us from sisterhood, prevent us from collaborating, from becoming a community of women cross-generational who can say, watch out for this. This is coming,
Right. I think the gray pubic hair is a good transition to my other question, which was, you were raised in this way in which there was a lot of shame and secrecy, and your parents kept a lot of things from you. And I'm wondering then, how did that translate into how you raised your children? And I can imagine either sort of keeping in that, and I can also imagine an overcompensating and an
overcompensate. You got it.
Oversharing.
Yeah, a lot of sharing. I had a conversation with a grandchild of mine when she was about 12, in which she asked me when I first had sex. And maybe you don't have those conversations with your grandmoms, but my kids have every possible kind of, my grandchildren have all kinds of, I'm like the person you can tell anything to. And so at 12, I had to calculate, am I going to tell her the truth? Because the truth was not great. I was acting out sexually because my mother died and I was pissed off at God. So what does a girl do when she's rebelling? She acts out sexually. Boys act out with violence. And I didn't really want to make it okay for her to have sex as early as I did. So I said to her, when you're just maybe 2 years older, I'll talk to you about this. Just come back to me on this one. But I did get my granddaughters. I have 2 granddaughters and 4 grandsons. And I did get one of my granddaughters a Judy Blume book, a little prematurely, you might say. I think she was 10.
And what about with your own kids? Were you the same way?
Yes, yes. I think I had to repair what was broken in my own childhood and especially in my parents' lives.
Right.
I tried not to carry forward what I thought was so destructive and so self-abnegating about their lives. They just weren't true to themselves.
Right.
They were performative.
Yeah.
I tried not to be. I wasn't as honest as I am in this book because this is kind of my last chance. I don't know if I'll get to write another book. And I sort of felt I have to own up.
Hearing you talk and thinking about sort of how your parents were and how you were with your kids, I feel like I heard somewhere or read somewhere that you had never been to therapy and that maybe that changed.
Oh, that's true. I hadn't been to therapy until 1 month ago. I started therapy about I cannot adjust to being old and everyone around me being old. And nobody talked about it. Maybe it's because a lot of people didn't get it, I'm hearing something.
Is there?
I'm hearing an echo.
Um,
No, you're not? Okay. Nobody talked. Nobody. Some noise is going on. Are you not hearing it? I'll proceed if no one else is.
I'm going to mute and see if that helps.
No, all right, okay. So, yeah, I think I've answered it enough. Oh, it said someone is not muted. Now it seems okay, right? It did, it stopped. Now you have to unmute yourself, Debbie. You are?
Okay.
Okay, there you
Now
are.
we're back in business. I found that very interesting and surprising. I mean, I grew up on, the Upper West Side, so I feel like you just start therapy when you're like 8. It's just a rite of passage. So I think it's really.
I mean, because there are so many old people, or you start therapy at 8?
No, like you start therapy at 8. It's just like it's just like in the water.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, a lot of people in my family are in therapy or have been. Right. I just never felt the need until I just couldn't handle this aging business and losing friends and seeing friends get sick. It was just too much. And it's helpful. I'm all for it. Therapy is very helpful, but I only started a month ago.
That's great. Letty, I would love to know everything about what it was like to be a founding editor at Ms. Magazine. So I'm going to jump back in time a little bit. Can you remind me both how old you were at that time and what year that was?
It was 1972, so I was 30, either 32 or 33, because I have a June birthday.
Okay, and how many kids did you have at that point? Did you have all 3?
I have all 3. I have twin girls. They were born in 1965, so they were 7, and I have well, I say I have twin girls and a boy. I actually have twin women and a man, since they're in their 50s now, and they have kids in their 20s. So David was in 1972 4, and Abigail and Robin were 7.
Okay. So I would love to know just sort of like what the spirit was at that time, like, and
It was intoxicating, and our editorial meetings are the one thing I missed since we all sold Ms. to the Feminist Majority Foundation in LA. But we had I think it was Tuesday morning editorial meetings that were just heaven for me. I mean, it was like a philosophy class, a sociology class, a confessional, a group therapy. It was everything. It was the movement personified. And people used to come into our editorial meeting and complain, lesbians would come in and say, we're not doing enough on lesbians. And homemakers would say, why don't we publish more about homemakers? And household workers would come in, and union organizers and students. I mean, we were the repository of the frustrations of so many American women, and we had an open door. I mean, Bella Abzug would come and hang out, and Grace Paley would come, and Eleanor Holmes Norton would come, and Flo Kennedy. And so it wasn't just us editors, it was also movement action that was going on. And we had desks in a bullpen, like a real mainstream media place location would have. We didn't have walls and stuff. Gloria was in a little indent with Joanne Edgar, but it was all open to us all. It was like, having a flow through kitchen and family room. And we had, very healthy editorial disputes, very, very serious ones and very funny ones. One of our editors was a real comic, and she put up the Groucho Marx duck. I don't know if anybody has any idea that Groucho Marx was a great comedian, and on his show, he used to have the duck would come down when somebody would say the magic word, which he had decided what it was in advance, and everyone would roar. So we had the duck, and it would pop down in the middle of an argument so that things would temper and calm down a little bit. The editors we were all passionate about everything that we were doing, and we all thought the movement was going to kind of solve it by 1980. It was all going to be done because everything was happening. Legislation was happening and litigation was happening. People were in the streets, and people were, changing the habits of their workplaces, and schools were changing, and women were admitting abuse and admitting incest and speaking out, not the way Me Too did, I'm sad to say, but for its time. I mean, 50 years ago, we've celebrated our 50th this year. We just were 50 years old, and it's still going strong, but in a different form.
This is sort of a prosaic question, but something that I think a lot of us think about, which is, how did you handle having the kids, having this career at that moment?
Well, I thought I was handling it just fine, but you may remember in the book, there is a chapter on mother guilt. I thought I was handling it just fine because my husband and I really did have it and do have an egalitarian marriage. And, he went out, I went out. He came home, I came home. It was, I did the cooking, but he did the clearing. There was always some balancing going on. And we talked at the dinner table about our work, and the kids picked up on it. And I thought it was all fine. And then when I was writing this book, my daughters, more than my son, but my daughters said, if the truth be told, which in their 50s, they're finally telling me, we could have used more of you. We would have liked more of you. And I worked only 3 days a week at Ms. And
Okay.
purposely, I worked a 10-hour day, and when I came home, I was totally focused. And the other days I was all theirs, except I also wrote books and articles. So I sometimes put up a sign on my door, "Mommy writing, please do not disturb." I thought that was fine because I was modeling what my mother couldn't, because my mother had to quit her work when she got married, because for Jewish American man, to be successful, he had to have a wife at home. Otherwise, if she was working outside the home, it made it look like he wasn't a good provider. And that was, again, that was the rule book of the 70s. A man was ashamed if his wife worked outside the home. It meant there was something inadequate about his capacity to earn enough money to support them.
Letty, do you remember, I think it was like the late 90s. I remember I went to a friend's graduation at Barnard, and Joyce Pernick, the editor, an editor at the New York Times, famously gave a speech. And I remember,
I know.
and she said,
My
she
closest
basically-
friend.
right, she said, you can't have it all, right? She said, it's a lie that you can have it all. And she said, if she had had children, she would have never made it to be like the Metro editor, I think it was, at the time. And I remember at the time, I thought that was like a shocking and horrible thing.
I told her so. I thought
I-
it was
I-
an awful message.
I thought it was an awful message. However, I'm also wondering if it was an awful message to tell us all that we could do all these things.
Well, the
and-
thing is that, you know, Joyce, I've said to her, I just saw her today, as a matter of fact, but come from the post office. She and many others misread what we were trying to accomplish in the women's movement. We didn't say have it all at the same time. We didn't imagine that you could have it all if you didn't have a partner who was a full partner, or, you know, somebody who really didn't just sit there and put his feet up at the end of dinner time. And if you didn't have money, if you didn't have enough money to have childcare, you couldn't have anything like it all. I don't think I had it all. I worked 3 days a week. I would have probably, if I was single, written more books. Who needs more books? I didn't. I tried to balance. I thought I was balancing. My kids were always reassuring me, it was fine, Mom, you know, we saw what you were doing. It was important, and we're grateful because you made changes that we're the beneficiaries of. They've said that, but they also now say, because I was so invested in making this work, they didn't feel comfortable saying, Mom, we really could use a little more of you, have a little more of you. And if I had made an open door, a feeling of that I would accept anything they had to tell me about their feelings, if I had made that more open and available, I think that we could have gotten through that. I could have made adjustments, but I didn't know that. I didn't know that because they were protecting me. They would have had to tell me, look, Mom, you think this balance is all really working, when sometimes we feel it's like this, and sometimes we would like more.
Right. I mean,
I know you have young children, right, Debbie?
not so, I mean, they're 10 and 13 now, so they're bigger now.
So how have you handled it?
I mean, not well, right? I think that there's like, there's a missing piece, because I feel like, right, obviously we're talking about like a certain class of women, but like, I think when you have two working parents, you have kids who still need all the same stuff, I feel like there's a correction that we haven't figured out. Like, it doesn't work. Like, you need I need one more person. I need one more adult in my family, I feel like, too.
In the first issue of Ms., we had an article, I Want a Wife.
Yeah.
And, every woman, no matter how good her marriage or partnership is, needs a wife. Because what the traditional wife did allowed men to become who they became. And that still works in many households, that the wife enables the man to pursue his dreams. Why? Because ultimately, it's, look, he makes more money. I might as well just quit my job. We can live on his, we can't live on mine. Somebody's got to be here. We have a sick child. We have a child with special needs. Who does it? The mom.
Yeah.
And the justification is very often economic.
I'm curious, I feel like you've seen, you sort of mentioned third wave feminism before, and I feel like you've seen many different
Iterations.
and of feminism, and I'm curious what your feeling is about what you see now. And it's a very broad question, but what feels different? What feels good? What feels challenging?
What feels good is I don't hear I'm not a feminist, but anymore. I used to hear that all the time. I'm not a feminist, but I want equal pay. I'm not a feminist, but I don't want anybody to abuse my body. They end up speaking feminism, but not using the term. Maybe the fact that Beyonce uses it, and Madonna uses it, and a lot of pop culture. That's what third wave did for us, is make pop culture part of the movement, or it made us part of their movement, put it that way, because it popularized the principles and allowed the word to be spoken. Nobody could believe, for instance, that like when I got out of college, you opened the New York Times Help Wanted ads, and you had one column that said Help Wanted Women and one that said Help Wanted Men.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you couldn't apply for anything in the Help Wanted Men column. You wouldn't be let in the door. In fact, if you went to an employment agency, there were pink cards and blue cards that listed jobs, literally. So, people have no idea how awful it was, how awful and how debilitating, and what an indignity it was to open a bank account and need your husband's or father's signature. I mean, you couldn't get a credit card without that. But let's not go off on that tangent, because Shanda is a book I wrote in order to out what happened to women in those years in personal terms, not just what happened when you went to get an insurance policy or sign a lease or a loan, but what happened to women's lives, which was embodied by not just my mothers and aunts, but my cousins. Several of them. And in my family, it's a Shanda, that it was a Shanda to have mental illness. So it was ignored and it wasn't addressed. And my favorite cousin and I, who played with each other ad nauseum, we were within 18 months of each other's age, were forced to play with another cousin who was 18 months older than my favorite cousin. And we couldn't, because she had many deficits, and nobody talked to us about it or helped us understand or guided us to the kind of play that would have been possible for her and us together. Because you don't have mental illness in a Jewish family, no way. Because if it gets out, not only does it made your family look bad, but there's not going to be a shidduch, there's not going to be a match, because people in the Jewish community are not going to want a chance having your genes if they produce serious illness, mental or physical. So women my mother hid the fact that she had cancer. I never knew she was dying until 6 weeks before she died, because no one would tell me that she had cancer. She wouldn't tell anybody.
Letty, I want to stay with feminism for one more minute. Okay. I know you never want to talk about feminism.
I've been talking about feminism for 50 years, but I'm happy to. You're my host.
and then you can choose the next question. But I'm curious, like, when you think about your granddaughters, how many do you have? You have
2 granddaughters, 4 grandsons. I think of them as well when I think of feminism.
Let's think of all 6 of them, right? In what ways do you feel like their world is better than yours, and in which ways do you think they face these challenges that you can't even wrap your head around?
Right. They don't have they have Shandas, but they aren't anything like mine or their parents. Gender fluidity, no big deal. I mean, just life. Just the way for us, sexual harassment was just life, but for them, the opposite. The good stuff is just life. For us, the bad stuff was just life. Sexual harassment, you had to expect it as a woman. You went into the workplace, that was simply going to be part of the equation. And it was for me, my whole work life, when I was in book publishing for 13 years before I was in magazines. But they have their own Shandas. They have, body issues, not mine in particular, but that generation. They have boyfriend problems and girlfriend problems, and don't necessarily want to be seen as people who have boyfriend and girlfriend problems. but of course, everybody does. Everybody does. So there still is that need to sort of project, except with your closest friends, that everything's fine in certain phases of your life, certain areas of your life. But none of the stuff that, although I must say, again, none of my children have had either an abortion or the need for a girlfriend to have an abortion. But women in that generation, in your generation, were not talking about abortion until we lost Roe. I mean, really, everyone was having it or knew somebody who was having an abortion, but it was still stigmatized. And we collaborated in our own stigmatization by not talking out about it. Because if we normalized it, and if we said it's part of our healthcare, it's part of our life planning, it's part of any responsible woman's decision making, we wouldn't have voted for some of the people we voted for because we weren't single issue. We should have been single issue voters, as each year was eroding our access to healthy care.
Funny. I was thinking, I mean, it's not funny at all, but I was thinking exactly about this when I was reading your book, and I found it really moving the way you were talking about your abortions. And I was thinking about how it's true. We don't, even in my generation, I feel like we didn't talk that much about it. And I think especially women who were pregnant once they were already mothers, especially never, I mean, had abortions once they were mothers, never talked about it, right? There was all this like shame around that too, which I think is interesting.
I have tremendous sorrow about that, because it played out politically. It played out politically. We just were a little too casual about, oh yeah, well now you need parental consent. Oh well, now you need 24-hour waiting periods. Oh well, now you have to look at a sonogram, but we can still get an abortion. So therefore, we're not going to make a big deal about it. And we're not going to vote for or against somebody on the grounds of their position on choice. That was a humongous mistake.
Yeah.
And we paid for it. But now I'm kind of grateful, because now we're facing it head on. And something's going to happen. Something big is going to happen. We saw in the midterms how many elections were decided on the grounds of choice.
Letty, our wonderful audience has some questions for you as well. So I'm going to go into the chat and share some of their questions with you. You don't have to, I can just read them to you, but or you can go if you want. Someone writes, Letty, as the person in your family who wanted to break the cycle of holding on to Shandas, what do you think is the best way to support how difficult that role can be?
Sometimes I think it's a great gift if you use yourself as a reason to start a conversation about secrets. You can say that, you can say, I was just on this, chat, whatever we're calling this Zoom. We're on this Zoom and Letty Pogrebin was talking about her book, and it's all about secrets, and it made me think, and then just blurt it, think about how awful it was to have to carry a secret that I was told, and I don't think it should be a secret. I think we should face it, or admit something, or ask a question about what you've always been confused by. I was so confused by so many things because there were secrets attached to them. I write about my Aunt Joan, who we felt sorry for years. We were just so sorry for her because she was barren. She told us she was barren when she first married my uncle. And before that, everyone was hawking her, badgering her about when she was going to get pregnant, because it was 2 years they'd been married and she wasn't pregnant. And then she finally admitted she was barren. And we all had to tiptoe around her and not let our children near her, because she would have to face how wonderful children are and she can't have any. And then one day after a Seder, she and I were talking, and my son David had just been born. 1968, I remember it well. And she was raving about my little baby, and I'm trying to distract her by talking about the chocolate covered matzah that we were both having after the Seder. And she said, stop it. I am not barren. I've been pregnant twice. I've had 2 abortions. I said, how could you do this? How could you lie like that? Why would you lie? And she said, because in your family to say you don't want children was unacceptable. A Jewish family where a woman didn't want children after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. She got married in 1946. You didn't want children in the late 40s after you had to replenish our people. So, I mean, that completely recast and reframed my whole feeling about how we were when she was in the room, how we were all treating her in this completely fake way because she couldn't admit the truth. She couldn't admit, I don't want a child, and my husband doesn't want a child. We do not feel like we are going to be good parents, and we're more interested in, and then she named a whole bunch of things she was interested in. Which, how could you do that? You would be like a selfish woman if you admitted you had other interests than to produce children for the Jewish people.
When did you become the person who would say the things that other people wouldn't say?
When I discovered you don't die from it. You know, I wrote about my first abortion in the New York Times magazine in 1990 something. Because I had never read anything in the paper of record that admitted that anybody had an abortion. And so I wrote about it, what it was like. And the thing I didn't do was write that I had 2 abortions, because how could a Jewish girl be so stupid, to get pregnant twice? So even then I was keeping a secret. I was admitting I had an abortion, here's what it was like. And I was hiding that I was so stupid and ill-informed, and I don't know what else I was, that I had it twice. So I wasn't entirely courageous.
I mean, I always feel like there are some people who are just born that way, who are willing to say hard things.
I was not born that way.
Now you're the person who will talk about the gray pubic hair.
And I stand by it.
We have another question from someone on the Zoom. Also, people feel free to add your questions. This is a Ms. Magazine question. Who made the revolutionary decision at Ms. Magazine to forego ads and all the restrictions the advertisers imposed?
We all did. I mean, that was our dream, was to be able to, write anything. But you couldn't do that if you didn't take ads. You became a nonprofit and you were not allowed to be political. So it was a trade-off. Either we had to take ads and have ads we hated. I mean, we censored some ads. We told some of our advertisers we will not publish that. We used to have a page in the back of the book, back of this magazine, called No Comment, in which we would show horrible ads that had women with their legs spread and a banana in the middle of it, and this is Chiquita banana or something disgustingly sexist and misogynistic and sexualizing and eroticizing of a plain ordinary woman. So either if we took ads, we had to argue with the advertisers and get them to not have sexist ads, and then we would take them, or we would lose the ad, which was hard because we were publishing on a shoestring. It looked like a glossy, high gloss magazine, but we never made any money. We started the Ms. Foundation for Women in order to have a place to put the profits. Ha, ha, ha. There were never any profits. But the Ms. Foundation is a very important institution, and it's been funding women's projects for 50 years. Never got money from the magazine, but raised money that never would have been raised for women's needs.
What do you think about the Me Too movement?
If there had been a Me Too movement when I was almost raped by a famous playwright, I would have spoken up, and I would have not just made it light of it like we always had to do. We had to laugh off that. I write about it in the book, my almost rape, because it was absurd the way I reacted. When you look at it now, I write about it. I wrote about it in my first book, 1970, How to Make It in a Man's World, and I tossed it off in that light sort of cosmos language, like it was just something that you have to put up with, and you have to have a word or a gesture, or you have to have an escape route, you have to have that, it was never, the problem was never the guy, it was that you didn't know how to handle it.
Right. I read that scene and it was very haunting, and in some ways too, and forgive me for saying this because there was nothing funny about it, but there was also this sort of like comical, absurd aspect of it in the story. I don't know if you feel like sharing it now.
Well, I'm not going to tell that whole story. It's way too long, and I tend to go into detail. I get in the weeds, but just suffice it to say that it was I would have been raped if I hadn't come up with what I happened to blurt out of the depths of my selfhood. And I hope you'll read the book to find out what I said. Not so that you can say the same thing when you are attacked, but so you can realize how ridiculous it is that we ever didn't share these stories and learn from one another.
Thanks, Letty. I'm going to read a couple more questions from folks here. So thinking about your abortion now, would you have been able to tell your parents at the time? If yes, how might they have reacted? I know you.
I'll let you. Yeah, my mother had died in 1955 when I was 15. I went away to school when I was 16, and I was pregnant in my senior year when I was 19. I went to my father for the first one. My father was a lawyer, a Talmud scholar, a big macher, a big Jew in the community. But I had no choice because I had no money, because my father, oh God, this is a whole getting into the weeds part, but my father pretended to be a very wealthy and successful guy, and then he was really hand to mouth. So he had me at Brandeis supporting myself to become independent. And so I didn't have money it was $300 for an abortion then in 1959. So I had to go to him, and he was very matter of fact, just the facts. He was just the facts. And he somehow or other found a gynecologist in Jamaica, Queens, Jewish gynecologist. I had the first abortion. The second abortion, I could never, ever have told him. The point is, I didn't tell anybody. That's why I was going to kill myself, because I didn't think I could possibly face anybody or ask for help from anybody. But my roommate at Brandeis, my senior year roommate, talked me into going to our dorm counselor, and she was connected to the abortion underground. God knows how many people she had helped get an abortion. None of us knew each other had been to her and asked for this kind of help. That's the Shanda. The Shanda is the way we were separated from each other as women because of shame. And so we weren't capable of helping and advising each other, comforting each other. We didn't know each other were there with the same issues. And a lot of that still happens.
There was a period in which you sort of walked away from Judaism. Can you say a little bit about why that was?
Yeah, I left Judaism for 15 years. You have to say, when I say I left Judaism, I was not a casual Jew. I was a very pious little kid, and raised in a conservative household in a high conservative shul, Jamaica Jewish Center. Rabbi Gershon Levy, for those of you who know great rabbis of the past. And my father was a bacher. He was the head of everything you could be the head of. So I was often on the bima, on his lap, or in the first pew. We were an important family in the community, and I took Judaism very seriously. I was one of the first girls in conservative Judaism to become a bat mitzvah in 1952. I went to Hebrew school, Hebrew high school, the Yeshiva of Central Queens. When I say I left Judaism, I left a very meaningful part of my life behind, because I was not counted in the minyan. Well, when my mother died, I knew that women didn't count in the minyan, but my father had the power. He was the gatekeeper of the Judaism I knew. He's the one who tutored me for my bat mitzvah. My father made rules for himself. He smoked on Shabbat, even though it was not permitted to make fire. My father found a way to issue a tshuva, a ruling, that he smoked on Shabbat, and he put out the cigarette blocks away. And he drove on Shabbat. In 1952, or 4, or something like that, conservative Judaism allowed you to drive only to shul, My father had already made this ruling for himself years ago. He drove to shul and parked 4 blocks away. Everything was stealthy, but I knew he had the power to make a ruling that I knew was against halacha, Jewish law. So that he didn't make a ruling that allowed me to count in my own mother's dominion at her shiva, the shiva for my own mother, with me being a quote bat mitzvah, daughter of the commandments, and an educated Jew, Jewishly for a girl in that era. It seemed to me untenable. You know, if I wasn't going to count, then I would count myself out, and I did for 15 years.
And you're back.
I came back because I became the chazanit, the cantor of our Fire Island congregation. We made a Fire Island for the Chagim, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We made a Fire Island congregation that rose out of the sand like Brigadoon. And the volunteer firefighter, the head of the volunteer fire department in this little town, Saltaire, Fire Island, became the rabbi. He didn't know any Hebrew. Nobody else knew enough Hebrew. And so I became the cantor. And I was the chazanit of that little congregation, which grew and grew and grew for 13 years. That was my second bat mitzvah, and that's what brought me back.
Letty, did I hear you say at some point or read somewhere that even when you had sort of left Judaism, you would still go for Yom Kippur for the
yeah, I went always for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur, I mean, you had to confess as a we, you're not as an I. There had to be there's a collective confession, and I would go shul shopping. It was very interesting. I would try out all the different shuls on the Upper West Side and go into the overflow service. You know, I would pay for my little ticket, and I didn't raise my children with any Hebrew school, or none of them were bar bat mitzvah. That's when they lost me. They lost my children. My daughter Abigail has taken very seriously reclaiming Judaism in her own powerful way. She was bat mitzvah at age 40. My other kids just feel it's too hard to catch up. And that's very sad to me, but all my grandchildren are very, very Jewish, and the home that they raise their children in is very Jewish. But when they lost me, they lost my educating my children in Judaism. I wasn't going to have any of it. Feminism became my religion. And it's a terrible Shanda that we lost so many women. Cynthia Ozick, who I happen to be the editor of Cynthia Ozick, which was another story when she wrote for Ms. And she once said to me, there was another Holocaust, you know, Letty. There was a Holocaust of all the lost women, the brains of all the lost women, the hearts, the Yiddishkeit of all the lost women who simply were not equal Jews. When I stand, she said, when I stand in shul, in my Orthodox shul, I know I am not considered a Jew by the men standing there. I'm not an equal Jew. And I mean, that was a huge thing I've never forgotten. Not a Shanda, a Holocaust. She used that word, and she's obsessed with, you know, Jewish survival, and why not? But you think about it, you think about how many women who were educated, even minimally, even that I was educated from age 3 till I left home at 16. And then at Brandeis, I was the secretary to Yitz Greenberg, who was the Hillel rabbi at Brandeis. And I had to make money. So luckily I found that job, which I loved. And then Yitz and Blue became very close friends in my adult life.
Letty, I want to thank you for being here today, for all of your work, for being such a pioneer and a role model for so many of us. I don't know if you can see, but the comments and messages to me are filled with thanks to you for speaking out and for being so honest, and hopefully making the rest of us brave enough to do so as well. So thank you so much for writing your book, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I hope I can get this the chat, because I haven't been reading it. Thank you, Thea, for nodding. Thank you, Mara. And thank you so much, Debbie, for letting me talk so much. You touched a chord in a big way. Bye.
Bye, thank you.